Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I'm Matt Bowes. I'm the general manager here at New West, and with me today is Ruth DyckFehderau, author of I, Athena, one of our spring 23 books. How are you today, Ruth?
I'm really well today. Thanks, Matt.
Good, good. So your book, I, Athena, this is your debut novel. You've done some nonfiction before, but why don't you let our listeners know what the story's about?
Aha, yeah, okay. The story is it starts with a young girl who, at about age 4, she contracts a scarlet fever, a really, really high fever, and she loses her hearing at that point. And the doctor consequently misdiagnoses her as profoundly retarded. That's the term they used then.
Hmm.
Um, and he sends her to an institution. So she lives in the institution and in group homes and all that kind of stuff after for about 30 years. The novel begins with her about 10 years after she exits that whole system. So she's out of the institution and she's trying to learn to integrate with mainstream society, where nothing works quite like she thinks it should. And she's also trying to understand her own life. So she's researching her own life through whatever documents exist. So she wants to understand why this happened in the first place. Um, and at the same time, she is trying to find a way to live with the man who was her lover when she was in the institution. And um, along the way, she uncovers all sorts of surprises.
Yeah, yeah. So as you say, it's kind of a story told through multiple media because you have Athena's sort of personal recollections of events, kind of her writing in a diary, I guess. And then I guess they could almost be sort of like historical recreations if it's her thinking about what was going on with her dad or going on with the personnel at the institution. And then there's all these documents. So it's quite the complicated narrative, actually.
Yeah, well, she's working on giving herself permission to tell her own story, but living as she has for so many years in an institution where someone else is making most decisions for her, um, she's not even really giving herself the permission to at the outset, she's not beginning giving herself the permission to really believe her own story. She
Hmm.
only believes what she finds in documents. And so, she does have her own journal where we get a fairly frank accounting of what's happening in her life. But what happened for those 30 years before? I mean, she spent much of the time medicated. She doesn't really trust her own memories. And so she's diving through all kinds of documents that are out there, just trying to understand her own life.
Yeah, and I think these days we feel a little like with all this panic about all this data and AI and stuff, like the documents and all, everyone's going to know everything about us all the time. But that's really a very, very modern thing. And the paper trail for a person like this would be really hard to track down, even up till 10 years ago, right? Like we
Right. Yeah.
they people weren't taking as much attention and everything wasn't digitized.
Hmm.
So it's really kind of a reminder of how challenging it would be to put together a story like this. Especially if you're someone like Athena who kind of like grew up almost like a feral child, basically. Like she's in this institution and isn't getting parented
Hmm.
and isn't really getting socialized even because they don't think she's capable of it. But she's
Right.
actually like quite smart.
Right.
So, like, did you ever, when you were working on the book and I know you did a lot of research, did you ever meet anyone like this who kind of got
Oh,
caught in a trap?
oh, yeah, yeah. This started like starting in high school, my summer jobs were often working with people with developmental disabilities, and um, that continued until grad school. And so just in various institutions and day programs and group homes, like I did all kinds of things in that larger field. Um, over a span of probably 10 years or more. And in that time, I met lots of people, actually, uh, or I should say, quite a few people at any rate, who had um, been institutionalized at some time after being misdiagnosed. Now, some of these people I met outside of the institutions, or like I worked with some people who had been misdiagnosed and were still in the program to some
Hmm.
degree. Um, but then after I started looking for it and talking about it, then I would meet more people who would say, "Oh, yeah, I spent some time in such and such because somebody thought I was blah blah blah."
Hmm.
Um, and then after I started talking about it even more, then I met all kinds of people who had had relatives, always women, by the way, who
Hmm.
had been misdiagnosed and institutionalized for a number of years. And in fact, I had a conversation with somebody not long ago um, who has gone through something very similar, like just within the last 10 years. So yeah, once I started looking, then I found quite a few examples of it. And the character of Athena is not based on any one person or even any five people. It's based on all kinds of readings, and it's fiction. I created her. But this
Hmm.
idea of somebody who had a high fever and was then misdiagnosed because of something that seemed a little off to someone. Um, yeah.
Hmm. Distressingly common then.
Yeah, yeah, and also not talked about all that
Yeah.
much. Um, and you talked about the fact that everything is now digitized and recorded. One of the things that I hope that comes across is that that kind of recording kind of only makes things worse. That
Hmm.
that the recordings are not reliable.
Hmm.
The fact that it's digitized, the fact that these words exist, um, you know, they exist to perform their own ideology.
Hmm.
And they don't necessarily speak the truth.
Hmm.
Because a human being, any human being, is always 1,000 times more complicated than anything you could ever put down on paper.
Yeah. Yeah, and things were pathologized back in the day that are, normalized now. I think probably one of the more tragic characters in the book is the young woman who is in the institution because she's gay. And if
Yeah,
I remember right, she checked herself in, right? Because
yeah,
she couldn't she felt that she just couldn't fit in society and had to be put away.
yeah.
And yeah, like she's just a horrifically tragic figure. But when you think about it, like someone like Alan Turing or
Hmm.
lots of people back in the day, it was just thought of, oh, it's a mental illness. They have to go where the mentally ill people are. So
Right.
did you come across people who were, pathologized for their sexuality as well in your research?
Um, yes. Uh, Certainly I found quite a few of those in written accounts. I
Hmm.
and yeah, I mean I list some of that in the acknowledgments where I'm listing some of my main sources of research. In 2009, 2008, 9, 10, around there, I was teaching quite a few queer literature courses, and somewhere around there, I ran across an article about somebody who had been institutionalized for being queer, uh, and it had just a really good bibliography.
Mm,
And so then I could start reading more and more and more and more. And yeah, it was, well, if the DSM says that homosexuality is a mental illness, then
yeah.
then someone gets treated as if they have a mental illness. And at that time, in the 50s, coming back from the war, where they're trying to create a culture that's pretty tidy,
Yeah.
and that's very legislated, and people fit nicely into these categories, then yeah, it's sort of a logical continuation of that. And even like if people were put into concentration camps in the World War II Holocaust because they were gay,
Hmm.
when those concentration camps were opened, those people were not always set free. The gay people were often,
Hmm.
if they were marked with the triangles, um, they were often sent to a different kind of um, institution, whether that was a prison or but something else, whatever was being done in that location at that time with people who were gay. But certainly they were not. It was not an easy thing
Yeah.
to be gay and be part of the wider culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think it's hard for some people to think about these days, but society has come a long way in that sense. Things are definitely better, but there's always room to grow and to get better. Something that I found really disturbing in this book was just forced medical procedures on people,
Mhm.
putting in uh, feeding tubes on someone who could eat if they wanted to, they could eat
Mhm.
normally, or
Mhm.
just always being sedated. And you told me that that was also pretty well known in the historical record, and that's basically a war crime. Like that is just pure evil. But
Mhm.
because it was done by the government under the guise of helping people, it's just accepted. Did anyone ever sort of face judgment for their actions in this sort of thing? Like it almost feels like we
Uh,
need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the way that people with uh, you know mental and physical disabilities were treated back in the day.
I am not aware
Yeah.
of anybody around that, except maybe for there I about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more, there were a few people who had been institutionalized because they were indigenous.
Mm,
And then they were, there were a lot of hysterectomies under,
hmm.
yeah. So I think Leilani Moore, there were a few others
Yeah.
who did class action lawsuits,
Hmm.
and that's essentially the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So that's the only one that I'm aware of. Yeah, that's the only one that I'm aware of. How would you even access that? I mean, the physicians could
Yeah.
close their files and say, um,
Doctor patient privilege, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so
I was just so mad at that doctor in the book, you know, he's such an
which
asshole.
doctor? There's a couple in here. Which one?
The main one who's basically just tranquilizing people as he walks by, and he's
Oh
kind of got
yeah.
the thing with the nurse. I don't want to get into it too much because of spoilers, but
Yeah.
that guy's a
Well,
real asshole.
I think I worked with physicians like that.
Hmm.
And if they really believe the ideology that this is what is helpful, what they're trying to do, they look at someone and they just see all kinds of turmoil inside, and
Hmm.
they believe that turmoil is because of something wrong in their brain. Instead of, you might look at that person and say, well, that turmoil is because that person is trying to communicate, and
Hmm.
either the disability is preventing them from communicating, um, or they haven't figured out a way to communicate, or you're medicating the crap out of them, and so that's why they're having a difficulty communicating. That's what you might see, but the
Hmm.
doctor might just like, especially if he's got hundreds of patients and has a really really busy day, he might just see that as part of the illness, and
Hmm.
that his job then is to relieve pain. And I worked with lots of people who believed that that was simply relieving pain. And so this doctor could very well believe that he is he is following the Hippocratic Oath.
Hmm.
And yeah, so and I think, we have to keep in mind that the people who, and any kind of medical personnel, they're human beings too.
Yeah.
Um, and they have their own histories that we don't know anything about most of the time. And, maybe they have their own reasons for why, when they look at this person, they think, oh, this is what's happening. Whereas another medical personnel might look at that person and say, oh, no, it's this. But if
Hmm.
you have an institution that is isolated, like I think that in the normal open system, there's a lot more chances for something like this to get out,
Hmm.
because you can go get a second opinion. You have a lot more agency. But as soon as you shut something down, as soon as you isolate someone so that they can access nobody,
Yeah.
then you get this kind of thing where you have a doctor who's just not being checked by anyone else. He's the only physician in the entire institution. I think if he had access to even one more physician, um, uh, then there would at least be conversation.
Yeah.
Um, or if he saw his nurses as the incredibly competent and educated people that they are, um, then we would have a different situation. But in this case, everybody's isolated, and everything might be great for a couple of years. But if you're completely isolated and the only thing you have in front of you is your own ideology, and your own ideology is pretty messed up, then you get this kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah. There's
And
always a lot of different angles on something like this. Like there's, you can't just blame one person. It's their training, it's their resources, etc. So it's it's
it's
it's tough to come up with all-encompassing ways of fixing this kind of thing.
yeah, in this case, what I hope people come away with is an urge to question whatever ideologies they believe so firmly.
Hmm.
Because whatever our belief system, it's always um, enmeshed with our own experiences and with um, what we're being exposed to, what we've read, what we've been taught. Um, but all of those things, uh, you know, are ideologies, and ideologies by themselves are not necessarily um, truth. They're believed as truth, they're treated as truth, but they're systems of thinking to help us
Yeah.
function. So and and it can be pretty easy actually to stop seeing somebody. um, so yeah, I hope that there is a little bit of, I guess, understand if for the nurse in that institution section, um, who I know who is often seen as a bit of a hypervillain. I hope there's a bit of understanding for her as
Hmm.
well. But
She's got her own things going on. I don't want to ruin it, but she's also dealing with some stuff that I think you layered in pretty cleverly, and it kind of
yeah,
builds over the course of the story.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, that's what's interesting about Athena is that her ideology comes from mostly reading books because she hasn't really been socialized because the people in the institution didn't think she was capable of it. So she's really kind of starting at square one in one sense by being a person out in the world and making friends, etc. But on the other hand, she has quite a background in science and technology, reading all these books and kind of getting all that stuff. So she's an interesting character in that sense.
yeah, yeah. I hope so.
Yeah. It's not all doom and gloom in the book, though. You do have a section of the book that is showing a kind of very interesting sort of holiday party. Why don't you set that up?
So this is at the beginning of the second section. Athena is, at this point, her name is Verity. She's a young girl. Her name is Verity. And she's about 4 years old. And she is in an institution that's quite isolated. This is at the beginning of her time there. Um, and she has arrived there at the same time as a new head nurse whose name is Harriet. And this perspective, this section is told largely from the perspective of Harriet, this head nurse, who is new at this institution. So this section that I'm going to read is the first Christmas party in the institution. Harriet is new to this place, and Verity is new to this place, and we're in an institution in the 60s, in the mid 60s, in a fake town that's in the Rocky Mountains. After the skate, after the short holiday open house, after everyone was safely inside and the public far away, the patients changed clothes for their Christmas party. Someone in administration who had never worked front line had decided a patient could be Santa Claus this year and had told him so. But within days, many patients wanted to be Santa Claus. A few of the orderlies had spent much of December sewing up 30 Santa Claus suits for those patients who wanted them. A reasonable, equitable solution. Harriet sat in the great room beside the snapping fire and across from the beribboned spruce under which Ruby was stuffing presents. The orderlies rolled the bedridden into the great room first. Even Julienne, the girl with hydrocephalus so severe it was dangerous to move her, was wheeled in on a stretcher. It had been piled high with pillows held in place with stretcher straps. An orderly sat behind her, resting a hand on either side of her enormous head to catch and steady it if it should slide in any direction. Her hair, more scalp than hair, had been washed and combed, and a red ribbon had been tied across her forehead. She was wearing lipstick. She looked pretty and smiled widely. Verity ran in, saw Harriet, smiled, and made straight for her lap. Harriet began to lift her off and onto the chair beside when Ruby said quietly, "Harriet, she's 4 years old, and you're the one she knows best. It's Christmas. Other patients don't sit on my lap." "They're not 4. The doctor left an hour ago. He won't know." Harriet said nothing, but allowed the child to relax against her. After a minute, Verity turned in Harriet's lap, took Harriet's face between her tiny hands, and kissed her nose. Harriet shifted her chair so that she could see who came through the doorway before they saw her, then gave Verity a quick squeeze and kissed the back of her head. Wearing a Santa Claus suit and navy slippers, a tall, thin man named Bernie walked in. He picked up a stacking chair and carried it to the wall, away from other people, sat down, and started to rock, quickly, intensely, hands curled inward and a stiff smile on his face. And then the second and third and fourth Santa Clauses walked in and sat down. Soon the chairs were full of red felt. It took half a minute for realization, followed by anguish, to set into their faces like cooling wax. Each Santa Claus had believed he or she would be the only Santa Claus. A moment, however brief, of distinction. Another half minute, and 30 Santa Clauses sat in the great room, wailing, 30 white pom-poms over a sea of red felt, bobbing as they cried. Ruby, Nigel the custodian, Harriet, the other staff, they looked at one another helplessly and quietly began to laugh. Harriet was in her element now. She lowered Verity to the floor and strode to the intercom on the wall. She called all available staff, custodial, kitchen, laundry, grounds, medical, to the great room. She directed 3 staff to stay there with the non-Santa patients and Nigel's grand fire, and the other staff to take 2 Santas each back to their rooms to dress again in everyday clothes. Harriet herself escorted Bernie and a Mongoloid fellow named Stephen back to their ward. Verity followed behind. Harriet sat the men side by side on Bernie's bed and reached to undo both waist buckles, one with each hand. In tandem, each man took her hand in both of his and gently pushed it away. She pulled off Stephen's hat, and when she reached to remove Bernie's, Stephen's hat went back on his head. Harriet stood back from the bed then and surveyed the ward. Everywhere, staff were having the same battle. A power struggle with a patient is already lost. Every psych nurse knew. Harriet left the young men there on the bed and hurried to the nurse's station where she had seen a plate of sugar cookies for the staff. She took 4 and returned to the room. She gave one to Verity, who stood by the bed quietly watching. She sat on the bed beside Bernie and she began to eat. Cookie? Stephen asked. Bernie didn't speak. He ate the crumbs that fell from Verity's cookie onto his bedspread. Certainly, Stephen, after you take off the Santa suit. If Verity and I were wearing Santa suits, we couldn't eat cookies. Bernie's suit came off without further coaxing. Stephen complied only after Bernie motioned a request to eat his cookie. With 2 Santa suits off, the other patients in the room began to relent, one at a time. In the afternoon's distress, though, Bernie and Stephen had wet their pants and neither wore diapers. The red of the felt was bleeding onto the white and green bedspread. A similar bleed was growing on bedspreads nearby, and the room was smelling unmistakably of warm urine. Harriet threw hospital policy about decency aside. She took Stephen and Bernie by the hand, not a stitch between them, and walked them down the hall. They paused at the nurse's station, one exasperated nurse out of uniform with 2 naked men. Stephen began jumping to watch his genitals swing. And Harriet called laundry and had them deliver extra diapers to all wards, including those where patients weren't diapered. And then they marched forward to the toilet room, Verity marching behind. It was a full hour before the party got underway again. Santa Claus suits forgotten, they gathered in the chairs and sang carols at the top of their lungs like there was no tomorrow, and none louder than Ruby. To Harriet, it sounded terrible. Only a handful could keep a tune. But here they were, inside, warm, safe, none slashed by skates, none eloped into the hills, and so happy. Since the patients had been promised, the staff decided that afternoon that each could be Santa for 1 week of the year. Someone wore a Santa suit nearly every week that year, and Christmas music played every month of the year. The following December, when Harriet went looking, the Christmas music records were gone. She did not file a complaint. If she'd known who'd removed them, she would have thanked them.
Yeah, having to listen to Christmas music every day would be an absolute nightmare. So I totally understand. But that is a section of I, Athena by Ruth DyckFehderau. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Ruth.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity, Matt. I appreciate it.
Book is available in stores and online now, so check out your favorite local bookseller and grab a copy, I say, or go to our website. You can get one delivered to you ASAP. So this is Matt Bose from New West Press Audio signing off.